right. Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, where every show I talk to writers from across the literary spectrum about their work and how they do what they do. From huge New York Times bestsellers to folks maybe who are just getting their work out there for the first time, the Open Mic is about and is for writers and the experience of writing and publishing in the modern age. And for those of you who don't know, this show is available by the same name on both YouTube and via all of the major podcast platforms. So you can subscribe to either or both, so you never miss a thing, depending on whether you prefer to watch me talk to an author or you prefer to just listen in the car. Either way is great by me. You could do me a real solid and hit subscribe on either of those platforms. And especially if you're on the podcast platform, if you wouldn't mind leaving me a nice review, that helps other people find the show. And I think hopefully after you've listened to today's show, you'll think that's a really good thing that other people can find this kind of content. My guest today is a fabulous award-winning author whose debut novel, Crazy Mountain, was one of my favorite books of 2022. Crazy Mountain has been called, quote, a grand tale of the power of wilderness to heal wounds, scars on the land, and the troubled humans who live in it, unquote, and an examination of a singular key question. And I really like this. How do we live in paradise without destroying the very thing we love? Her writing has been called artful, lyrical, and deeply moving, and I wholeheartedly agree. And this is the book, Crazy Mountain. So without further delay, please welcome Elise Atchison to the Open Mic. Good morning, Elise, and thank you for being here, number one. And number two, please tell me I pronounced your last name correctly.
Yep, that was correct.
Okay.
And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoy your interviews. You've got a great show.
Fabulous. Well, I appreciate that very much. Well, let's start with the basics. For those folks who haven't discovered the book yet, and I'm going to hold it up one more time if you haven't seen it, tell us about Crazy Mountain.
So Crazy Mountain, it follows the development of a mountain valley in Montana over almost 50 years. And it goes from open space to heavily developed space. And it's told through many different perspectives. So we're getting perspectives of the ranchers who originally owned the land, the developers, the people who move in, the subdivisions, the wealthy people who move in, it goes through many different perspectives to show how many different people see the changes in the landscape. But it's really the story of the land and how the land changes over time as it moves, which is, anyone who lives in the West has seen this happen.
Right. Well, I really love this book because it resonates with me on lots of levels. My mother was born in a little town about 10 miles southeast of Sheridan, Wyoming. My uncle was born in a little place you're probably familiar with called Otter, which is kind of a white spot in the Powder River County. My aunt was also born there. My youngest aunt, my oldest aunt, was born in Wyoming as well. My grandfather was born in South Dakota. My mom's family has a long history in the Mountain West, and my generation, my cousins, my sister, brother, we were the first ones to not be raised in that environment. We are the urban dwellers and always have been, even though we're all very outdoorsy people, we were not raised in that environment. But I grew up, of course, hearing so many stories about living a ranch life in, the rural part of the country, many years ago. And so as I'm reading it, I'm really hearing in a lot of ways my mom's stories in my head and thinking about some of the things that they talked about it later on in their in life, and reflected on the changes. And then even later, when they came to California, they always stayed in the very rural places. And so those changes have been very constant. So it's a long-winded way of saying it really resonated with me a lot. I know from reading a little bit about you that you also live off the grid, very much out of this mainstream. So Maybe give me some of your perspective on writing this. I imagine that a lot of the stories in this book are things that you've encountered in your daily life. Am I correct?
Well, I think I write fiction, so it's definitely fictional. I'm not like taking a specific person and writing about them, or a specific incident and writing about it. It's more a conglomeration of experiences that come out in, I mean, the story grows, the characters grow out of the story for me when I'm writing fiction, and the story grows out of the characters. But the way that reality comes in is, you can flesh it out with your own experiences. So, I've lived close to the land for a long time, so I can flesh out that experience. I've had a lot of the jobs that the characters in the books have had. I've been a landscaper, I've been a pizza delivery driver, lots of those jobs within the book. So but those characters aren't me or anybody I know. They're formed in the writing of the story. So they aren't a one-to-one experience. Nevertheless, what's going on in this book is really going on all over the West. And so it really could be any small town. It's realism, but it's not taken directly from life.
Right. I as long as I can remember, because I have family up in the upper Northwest, Seattle area, and we have friends all over. And I could, for the longest time, the thing was the fear of invasions from California, right? Which I totally get. I totally get. And I know that's one of the things I hear, because I have friends in Montana, of course, mutual friend Craig Lancaster and others, but other friends from many, many years. And so I've heard this for a very long time. I have friends in Kalispell and Whitefish and folks, and you hear constantly about especially places like Whitefish, where it feels like half the population now is from LA, that kind of thing. And I remember years ago when I lived in LA, I never met anybody from LA. Everybody I met was from the East Coast. And so there's always this
Right.
Something of resentment about these folks coming from other locations and changing things. Do you find that to be a constant, or an accurate assessment of how folks that like yourself that have lived in Montana for a long time feel about this evolution?
I don't think it's meant to demonize anybody. I try to get many different perspectives. And I think part of it is when a place take a rural place. I mean, for me, environmentally, it concerns me a lot, because, you're taking away a lot of habitat and developing it. And so it is drastically changing the ecosystem. That concerns me, and it should concern everybody, because habitat, the loss of biodiversity is directly related to the loss of habitat. So there's that aspect. And then there's the social aspect, where gentrification, when people come in with a whole lot of money, suddenly the people who live there can't afford to live there anymore. There's no housing. It changes the sociology of the culture of the area in ways that make it really hard for people who don't come in with a lot of money. So there's that aspect of it. There's the change in the gentrification, and that happens in inner cities too. I mean, it happens everywhere. Gentrification, can kick out the people who have lived there forever. So there's that aspect of it, and it's not meant to demonize anybody, because everybody moves around. It's like you just pointed out. It's not, but still. There are those aspects and changes of the land and the culture that I guess I'm exploring in the book.
Well, that's one of the things I really liked about it. You do explore those issues, gentrification for sure. And yes, I'll agree. We're here through the pandemic. One of the things that changed in the pandemic, of course, is people could work remotely. I live in a college town in Northern California that has just been overrun, I think in the minds of a lot of people who grew up here, by folks moving from the Bay Area, because they no longer, they can cash out or whatever. They can continue to work at Google and make ridiculous money and come to a smaller community, etc. Well, as you can imagine, the housing prices here have damn near doubled in the last few years, and it was already expensive. And so it is forcing a lot of people now especially service class folks. You know, if you're working, you can't buy a house in this town and work at Starbucks. It doesn't.
Right.
That's non-existent. That's most of California, I think, in this day and age. So that part resonated with me quite a bit. Some of also what resonated with me is how a lot of that is also driven by people who are already there. They want to make money off
Yeah.
of the
Oh, it's
resources they have. So I thought you did a really wonderful job of telling this story in a very nuanced way. As you noted, no, you weren't demonizing anybody. These are very human, very fallible characters that I found incredibly interesting. And for whatever that's work, I guess the question in there is, you mentioned characters coming out of story and story coming out of characters. Is this one where you started with the story and developed the characters? And is that normally how you write, or do you normally start with characters and develop a story, or do you have a way that you do it? Is each because I know you write a lot of short stories, and which I'll ask you about too, but is that how normally where you start with story and then move on to character?
No, not usually. I mean, I don't really think about it. I write, so I'm usually am starting with a character in a situation, and I don't have an idea of where it's going to go or what it's going to do. I just write and see where it goes. And which is a very inefficient way of writing, because you end up throwing out a lot of the stuff that you've written when you finally figure out what it is you're actually writing. But a lot of people do write that way. And a lot of other people are much more organized and they know exactly what they're going to do when they go in. But I tend to it develops while I'm writing it. So
I'm going to presume by that you are not a outliner.
no. Now, after I get through a couple of drafts, I might go, then that's when I go back and think about it. And think about, well, how does this fit together? Or for instance, in Crazy Mountain, it was later on that I realized I had 2 chapters of characters that were very similar. And I had to just take one of those chapters out. Things like that. You start to think about it more as a whole, or how the story fits together in the revision process, rather than in the initial writing of the story.
Yeah,
And that's.
Oh, sorry. The editing. I think that's one of the things that I always want to explore with every writer I talk to. What do your first drafts look like? I know everybody loves to type the end, on that first draft, but
oh, it's like who was it who said I used an explicit what did he call it? Was it Hemingway? Said the first draft is shit or whatever. Yeah. I don't know who said that, but somebody did. And I'd say that's definitely true. And like you said, there was nuance in here. I think nuance and complexity come in more when you're rewriting it, because you're deepening the characters, you're deepening the story, you're thinking about it more. Whereas in the first draft, you're just kind of getting it down, and you may have something maybe stock, and you go back and you start to think about that character more and what's driving them, what is their desire, what are they trying to do, what's in their way, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and when I think about characters and how they fit in a story, especially one with a lot of characters like this book, and how it's told across timelines and everything, and generations, I guess, there really does have to be a depth to each of these characters. Did you, I guess, is that a difficult thing for you? And how much time do you put into maybe making sure that your characters are well-rounded and developed fully? Is that the more difficult aspect of this story writing for you than the story? Or is it really situational for you?
Well, I would say that it's more difficult with some characters than with others, because some I could relate to more personally, and those were easier to get into their mind and how they're thinking. Whereas some of the characters that may be further from my way of thinking, I had to really work harder to put myself in their shoes and think how they're what they're thinking about everything. There's a number of characters in there who you could easily vilify, but I didn't, I want to get into their mind and find out exactly who they are and what's driving them. And that's the hard part for me. There were a few characters that I guess it just doesn't feel right to me. I know it's just not, the character just doesn't feel right. It's not, the character isn't completely developed. So I'll continue, thinking about him and working on it until it feels like it feels right. Feels like
Right.
the character's fully developed.
I think the West has always fascinated readers and, of course, moviegoers. At the tales of the West have been a dominant part of media culture for a long time. But I think when you say Western, most people think of John Wayne movies, Zane Grey books, that kind of thing, for obvious reasons. But there has been a lot of interest in recent years in the modern West, and unfortunately, a lot of them are soapy things like Yellowstone that are still not realistic, I think, in any way. Because one of the things I really liked also about this book is that there's a real sense of realism to it. And I'm just curious, when you see, and God bless Taylor Sheridan. I mean, he's a great writer, and I'm not trying to criticize him, but I mean, Yellowstone is a big soapy thing, right? And that does still seem to draw people in, right? Because it's still all about big ranch, big money, big, and big drama and all that kind of stuff. But that's not really the life of most modern people in the West. So I'm just curious, when you does the success of something like a Yellowstone help or hurt a writer like yourself who's trying to write more realistic tales of the modern American West?
Well, I think that has to do with what drives you as a writer, maybe, because I don't really concern myself with that too much. I actually haven't watched Yellowstone. I watched part of it, and I need to get back to it because so many readers have told me, oh, well, this is the realism as opposed to, kind of counter narrative to Yellowstone. So I feel like I have to go back and watch the whole thing. But I understand the draw of it because, we all like to be entertained. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being, but what drives you as a writer, I'm not necessarily thinking what's going to entertain the movie audience. That's not what's driving me as a writer. So,
right.
So I'm just not concerned with that.
Good. Because, this is another lesson to folks who are thinking about getting started. I mean, you can't be overly influenced, right, by those outside things. I think it's Stephen King is the one who always said, write the story you want to write and worry about all the other things later. And I'm sure he's not the only one, but it's the one that sticks in my head. But along those lines, what are some of maybe the influences for you as a writer, whether it be other writers or what have you? What's been inspirational for you in your writing experience?
Boy, I've definitely been influenced by every book I've ever read. I mean, I couldn't be a writer without having read a lot and been deeply moved by books I've read. And there've been so many of them and so many different types of books that I think it's the wide range that's helpful rather than just. And I've been influenced by so many, both nonfiction and fiction writers. I write nonfiction too, but they influence my fiction too, and every writer who's on the back of this book has had a big influence on me. Deborah Magpie Erling, you were talking about Western, she has an absolutely fabulous reissue of Perma Red, which is a wonderful book. And Laura Pritchard has a book coming out soon. It's fiction. That's fabulous. And she's influenced me. And all of the people on the back, Ellen Morris Jones, Doug Peacock, Shan Ray, Kim Barnes. I don't know if you've read any of those, but they're all wonderful writers. But really, I mean, reading 100 Years of Solitude or Legends of the Fall when I was in my, young, all of those things, if they move me or they interest me, they're influencing me as a writer. But I don't read, some writers read and pick it apart and study it and see how it's put together. I've never been able to do that because I always get lost in the story. But I think it through infusion, or through, I don't know what you'd call it, but it just infusion or whatever, it comes into your way of thinking about writing when you've read a lot of stuff that what moves you, the language that you really love, the way language is used. And I think that influences you whether you're consciously thinking about it or not.
You know, I really, that resonates with me a lot too, because I read an astonishing number of books, I'm sure, but both fiction and nonfiction. I think most of what I read is fiction, but some of the best writing I've ever read is nonfiction, and great narrative nonfiction. I'm a reporter by trade and an editor by trade, and you know, I've been covering politicians for a long time. Somehow that hasn't completely jaded me on the world yet, I don't think. So I still like to.
Journalists are the most important people of our time right now.
Politicians are?
No, journalists.
Oh, journalists. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, hopefully there's a few of us left here in
Yeah.
my lifetime, but the point of all that being is I think you can get a lot from a lot of areas if you're open to that. I will say though, I'm with you. I try to read critically like that and see how somebody did it, but it's usually when I go back and look at it later, because I have never been able to do that either.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons I bring stuff like this up, because I've got, a lot of folks watch the show or listen to the show, and they're thinking about their own writing and becoming a writer, and they're trying to figure out things. And one of the things I think that's the hardest to figure out is because you get all this advice, you hear things all the time, and you pick up books at the bookstore, and this is how you do it. And I think a lot of folks, if they're not comfortable doing it how the book said or how somebody said, they feel like, oh, well, I can't do it. But I think the thing that I have learned from doing this show for a long, long time now is that there's a million ways to do something. You have to find the one that works for you. And the rules that apply to everybody don't really apply to everybody. And so that's again a long-winded way of asking you, because I know you write short stories. Of course, this is the debut novel. What has been over the course of your time, maybe what are some of the lessons that you had to learn the hard way, that helped you develop the resilience to keep at it, especially when maybe you weren't having success? What kept you going when you were getting into this and trying to figure out if you were going to keep doing it?
Well, I think you have to be driven intrinsically, because if you're looking for external validation, it's going to be tough, regardless of, for most people, you definitely have to work through times when you are not getting external validation, and you just need to continue working. And I agree 100% with what you just said about there being as many ways to write as there are writers. There are no rules, but at the same time, it helps to be open to everything everybody says, but not take it and say, this is it, this is what I need to do. Just listen to it and think about it and think whether that works for you or not. I've been lucky to work with a lot of writers through the years, both, very famous writers who, can give you advice, but also people who are just starting out. They can give you just as good advice. You have to be open to what is being offered you. You have to be open to learning, I guess is what I'm trying to say. If you're thinking, oh, I can only learn from really well-known authors, or I can only write this way because this person I admire writes this way, then you're going the wrong way. I think most writers are kind of rebellious, and right. We're going to go our own way, regardless of everybody telling us not to.
Right. Yeah, kind of like journalists. How do you handle rejection?
Well, it's part of being a writer. Even everybody I admire, most writers admire, go through rejection all the time. You have to get a tough skin if you're going to be a writer, and you can't judge your work in that way, because you have to believe. You definitely take advice if somebody offers advice that you find useful, but you can't be looking for external validation all the time as a writer, I don't think, or any kind of artist, I think. Or you're just gonna be working towards the trends, which I don't think is useful at all. I think what you were saying earlier, I think when people follow what they really want to do, they're going to be doing the best work. Whereas if they're following what they think the market wants, or I think that's going to put make their work less powerful, less strong.
You know, I totally agree with that, though I think the caveat maybe, and I would really be interested in your perspective, I think the caveat maybe in genre fiction, where it feels like there's a lot of rules, like if you're going to write crime fiction or you're going to write paranormal romance or whatever it is, there are things readers expect. I will say it was one of the real pleasures of Crazy Mountain is I got things out of it I didn't expect. And I'm not sure what I expected, to be honest with you, when I started reading it. Again, other than, okay, this is a tale of the modern West. I read I knew what it was about, but there were things there that I didn't expect. And that can be really good, like in this case, or, if you expected it to be crime fiction, well, you would be very disappointed, right? So, I don't know, how would you categorize Crazy Mountain? Did you run into that when you wrote it, in terms of, because that happens to so many writers, their work, it does get a little pigeonholed, or they hear a lot, is maybe it gets rejected because an agent or a publisher doesn't know where to fit it. They don't know how to sell it. They say it's good, but I don't know what category to put it in, so I can't sell it. I mean, did you run into any of that with Crazy Mountain? I mean,
well, I think I finished it before I started thinking about how to describe it and how to, find a publisher for it. And I think that's the way to do it, not to do it while you're writing it. But I would go back and say, like Ursula Le Guin or Margaret Atwood, they break the rules on genre and they do a splendid job, So there are a lot of people who break the rules and still write amazing work in genre. But back to wait, what was I talking about? I've lost my
that's my fault, because I asked you a meandering question, but what I finally got to was, how did you categorize how you categorize in your head? And did you run into any issues when you went to find a publisher with them, maybe not knowing, maybe you did not run into that, but I'm asking if you ran into any of that questions about where it would fit in terms of market.
Well, when I was writing it, I thought of it strictly as a novel, even though I was writing it in this unusual form. I still thought of it strictly as a novel, a whole book, a story told through the whole book. And the thing is, when I finished it, I thought, well, wait a second, this is a little different, how am I going to describe this? And then I started learning about novels and stories, and I don't know if you've read The Imperfectionist by Tom Rockman. If you're a journalist, you probably love that one. It's formulated in the same way, in that it tells the story of newspaper going from paper to digital, and what happens to all the work. So each chapter takes you into a different person related to that newspaper and takes you through the process. It's really quite similar to the way this is structured, but I didn't start realizing what the structure was until I finished it and said, what the hell did I write? And then, Winesburg, Sherwood Anderson has written a similar with Winesburg, Ohio. There's a number of books, Jennifer Egan's Screen Squad. So it was after I wrote it that I began to think, well, what about this structure, and because it's an unusual structure, which is hard to market to people who want something they can easily call what they want to call it. But I don't worry about that when I'm writing. It's only after the fact and then you just have to try to make it sound as interesting as possible when you're trying to market it. But it is an unusual structure, which I think makes it harder to pigeonhole into a category.
And I'm wondering too, we talked about getting advice and getting input from people. I guess one of the challenges I think, again, a lot of writers have is they don't know which advice to let go and which one to follow. And it can be really challenging. And I had a writer one time who went on to be very successful, but she told me when she was in her earlier stages, she was in a writer's group where there was a person in the group. He had, had a lot of books traditionally published. So he was kind of the alpha in the group. And he was really critical of her work, and she kept changing it. And she found herself essentially trying to get his approval until at some point she got angry and said, to hell with this. And, she threw out all the crap that he had influenced her to do. She went back to her own thing. Well, she ended up getting a 3-book deal out of the chute. And it's because she's a fabulous writer, great storyteller. So there's a lot to be said too for knowing when to say no to
Absolutely.
advice. Did you have any moments like that where you said thank you, but
I think I'm a born rebel. So, I actually like criticism. I like to get criticism because it allows me to, sometimes I'll think about something completely different than the way I had been, and maybe I won't take that advice, but still I went down that path and thought about it in a different way. And I find that useful to think about things in a different way. But I think what you're talking about, that problem, I've seen that over and over again in groups where they say, oh, if I get advice, I take it right away. And it's like, no, don't do that. You've got to think about it. But I think you learn that with time, like you said about that one woman. If you continue doing it that way, you're not going to get your best work. You need to know how to take advice, how to use advice in a way that works for you, which takes time. And I think it helps too if you have a workshop or group leader who makes that clear, who kind of helps people realize that you're not supposed to take all the advice you get here. It's just stuff to make you think about your work in different ways. And that's useful, I think, to see how a reader comes to your work.
right. Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely had that experience where, I've chased my tail a lot in my life, and the greatest success I've ever had is when I stopped trying to chase my tail and I just wrote the thing I actually wanted to write. It's amazing how much better it comes out. I mean, it really does.
Yeah.
This is one of the things in life where I think you really do have to be, I don't want to say selfish, that's not the right term, but you have to find something internally that just
Right.
says, to hell with you, I'm doing this thing, right? This is the thing
You have
that
to believe in what you're doing. Yeah.
well, yeah, because if you don't, who will, right?
Yeah. And there may be people all around you. I mean, there's so many writers have written work that was constantly criticized. I mean, same with artists. Van Gogh didn't sell during his, I'm not supposed to say go anymore, but it didn't sell any of his work in his lifetime, and many other artists. I
Right.
don't know.
I want to ask you about short stories. I love short stories. I read a ton of short stories, anthologies of all kinds. It's a beautiful, beautiful art form. And I know you've written a lot of short stories in your life. Is there a different approach that you take to writing a short story than you did with writing Crazy Mountain? Is it the same? What's your perspective on how you approach the short story?
So I think the main difference really is the time that's spent on it, not so much I mean, certainly with a book, you're looking at a larger story that you have to fit together, but, and you can digress more, you can go into more things, and a story has to be very tight and very, it has to fit within a short period of time or space. And I actually like writing books, but they take a heck of a lot more time than a story. And I think, if you haven't got, and some of my favorite writers are short story writers. I mean, Alice Munro, there's all kinds of story writers who are just write beautifully. And I don't think it really matters whether you write it as a story or a book. It's more just what tells the story you want to be telling. And I kind of lean towards books now. I think when you get older, you realize you only have so much time. And if you want to get things done, you better get them done.
Well, and the reason I ask too is because, of course, Crazy Mountain is told chronologically over a half century, but so many of the chapters could stand alone.
Right.
In fact, a couple times a month, my mother-in-law is in an assisted living facility, and a couple times a month I go and I read to her and other folks that are in the facility. And I pick short stories because a novel, when you're only going every once in a while, is not a good idea for that group. So I try to keep short stories so it can be something beginning, middle, end right there. And I took one of the stories out of Crazy Mountain and read it recently, and I thought it was fine. It actually read quite well.
Yeah.
And I actually hadn't read the full book yet. So when I went back and read it, and I said, oh gosh, it it was a different experience reading about those characters earlier in the iteration from because the story I read was from later in the book. And so I loved the way that built. And I'm curious, is this a format you'll repeat, or have you thought about taking a bunch of those short stories that you've written and doing an anthology of your own? I mean, what is the, what's your thinking along those lines?
Well, I'm working on a novel right now from one point of view, which is a really different, way of approaching the book. But with Crazy Mountain, I mean, the reason that each one holds to a story in its own is because I am telling each character's story within each chapter, and I'm trying to get a full story for that character, how they relate to the land and how they relate to the changes in the land. I don't want it to be dependent on any of the other characters. Each character story, I wanted each character to have their own story, their own voice, their own way of relating to the land. So that's kind of why I picked that structure. And I wasn't really thinking about it a whole lot. I just knew I wanted to get deep into these characters' perspectives of what was going on. And that was the best way to do it. If you did it, you couldn't do it from one point of view. You really couldn't. And you couldn't do it. You could go back and forth between points of views, but I wanted to get all of those points of views in the book. And really the main character is the land, and it's being told through these different stories. Mm-hmm. So that's why that ended up being what some people call a novel in stories, because I did want each character to have their own individual stories that held together for them, that told their way, told completely how they are experiencing this. So that's why that structure. And my next book, like I said, is from one perspective, and really you can feel the limitations of that too, because there's all these other characters who have perspectives, but you have to see them through the one character, not through their own perspective, which really limits those other characters. And I think the way that the Crazy Mountain, it's more like real life, because we live in a world with so many different perspectives. And we live in a community of perspectives, and there's no central, I mean, we think of ourselves often as the central person, but we aren't. We're just one of many perspectives. And so I actually think that this structure is more like realism. We live in a community, and that's what the structure really creates, is a community of people.
Yeah, I like the structure a lot, and I like, because you have a lot of characters in it, and I think the way you did it was really good, because it would be very easy to have do head hopping if you're trying to get them all into, based on events as opposed to the different perspectives of the characters. It could have been really hard to keep from just head hopping all over the place within each chapter, and it doesn't do that, since each one is coming from the perspective of a particular character or two. It really worked. I thought, again, it's one of the things I really enjoyed about it. Well, I don't want to keep you too long, so I always like to end on what I intend to be a fun question. And I do. I hope it's a fun question for you. Let's just say I had the magic power to put you together with any one of the following three people for anything you want: dinner, drinks, whatever, hike. Who would you choose and why? The options I'm going to give you: three people. I think they're associated with a lot of things, but the outdoors is certainly one of the things that they are all associated with. Your options are Ernest Hemingway, Teddy Roosevelt, or Georgia O'Keeffe.
Oh, no, hands down, Georgia O'Keeffe. The others would be very interesting, but I feel like I know what they would say. I feel like I know where they would be coming from, but which probably isn't true. I'm probably, categorizing them there, but I feel like I know what kind of person they would be and what they would say. Whereas Georgia would be very interesting, I think, to sit down with. And she's one of I look up to her. I think I'm inspired by her. She's an amazing woman. She's done amazing things. And she went her own way. She was a rebel. She never listened to anybody. She did what she wanted to do. And that's why we have her great art. I mean, and she lived out at the Ghost Ranch. She lived out.
I've been there. My wife and I had the opportunity. We went last year and did some horseback riding there, and just around that whole area. It's unbelievably beautiful area. Yeah, she's an impressive, or was an impressive person. So
Yeah, thank
great
you.
choice.
Not to put the others down. But
Right. It's never about a knock on anyone else, you know. But well, Elise, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. I'm going to hold the book up one more time for those of you watching on the YouTube channel. If you haven't seen the book, I highly recommend it. It came out last year. Crazy Mountain by Elise Atchison. Great collection. Or not a great collection of stories. I was going to say almost. Never mind what I was going to say. Great novel. This is really good stuff here. I highly recommend it. Elise.
Thank you so much, Rich. I
Oh,
enjoyed
thank
it.
you. I appreciate it. Appreciate you making time to chat with this odd guy that you've never met before. So
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
great. And for all of you out there, I hope you also got something great out of this. If you did, please hit the subscribe button. We'd love to have you come see us on a regular basis, where you can glean a lot of great stuff about writers and writing and how they do what they do. And you know what? It's a lot less expensive than going out and buying all those expensive craft books at Barnes and Noble, right? Because this one's free. And if you would be so kind, leave me a nice review. I don't make any money doing this. This is just something I do because I really like talking to writers who tend to be really smart people, which I really enjoy that. So I hope you do too. The last thing I will leave you with, same thing I always leave you with: tomorrow is not promised to anybody, so please make today count. Until then, for my guest, Elise Atchison, and myself, Rich Eisen, this has been the Open Mic Writers in Their Own Words. Take care.
Thank you.